speak in the Spirit of Christ, the Word made flesh for the life of the world. Amen. Please be seated. I'm going to use the lectern so I can use my hands and don't have to hold the microphone and you can still hear me. So it's lovely to be back here at St. Paul's, lovely to see the place after the renovations. We still live in the neighborhood, we never left. Rick said you were expecting wise men from the east, so I'm just from like the other side of Shoppers Drug Mart. So it's good to be here. Rick invited me to share with you some of what we've been doing at St. Christopher's about worship and ways we've been trying to integrate that in the life of our community because he thinks that might be something helpful as you get into this discernment, holy conversation process with Kristen. So let me tell you a bit about that. About 15 years ago, I had two major epiphanies. The first one went like this. We were working with a parish that was having a conversation about how to relate to its neighbors better. They wanted to connect with people in their surrounding area, and they wanted to discover what it was they needed to do to be more hospitable to others and in order to have a kind of life-changing impact on other people. In the course of the conversation, a woman who'd been a member of the congregation all her life, for decades, I'm thinking at least 7, pushing 8, said, "Why do we have to worry about anybody else? Why can't we just look after ourselves?" Now, as that story got around among my clergy colleagues, they were shocked and appalled. I mean, that's this horrible woman. Like, how could she say such a thing? But I thought about it more and more, and I realized, you know what? There's nothing wrong with this woman. She's a product of formation in our community. The fact that a lifetime of Anglican worship had taught her only about the mission of the church that we should look after ourselves was a shameful judgment on us, not on her. If a lifetime of worship succeeded in telling this woman that it was somehow okay in a discourse about the mission of the church to ask the question, why do we have to worry about anyone else? There's clearly something wrong with the curriculum, and the curriculum needs to be changed. So I began to wonder, what would it take for us to reshape the way we worship so that people had a deeper sense of mission, a deeper sense of discipleship, and were really able to integrate faith and daily living so that the things that were proclaimed in Sunday were actually related to how we might live Monday to Saturday. The other epiphany was this. People don't come to church all the time. You can laugh at that. It's okay. We all know. I mean, 1 Sunday in 3 is now regular attendance. People are not going to sign up for extra midweek programs to learn the lessons in mission and discipleship they need to learn. They actually need to learn them in church on Sunday. So we need to find a way to make the most of Sunday morning so that Sunday morning does the kind of formation it needs to do to create the people God needs us to be in order to make a godly difference in the world around us. So for the last 6 years at St. Christopher's, we've been taking this approach to what we call liturgy and learning. We begin in April of each year, or May, just after Easter, for what we call Discernment Day. We invite everyone in the parish to come. We spend the day praying and reflecting on what's going on in our lives. Where is God in our lives? How is God inviting us to learn or grow or change? How are we being challenged? Where do we need healing? What's the comfort we seek? What's the comfort God offers? So in that conversation, we identify some themes that we think we as a community need to focus on in the coming year. And we peg those themes to the liturgical calendar and try to do that in a judicious way. Because there's some themes that work for Advent and Lent that don't work necessarily for Epiphany-tide or Eastertide. We don't ask ourselves, what do we want? Instead, the question we're asking ourselves is, what do we need to do to fulfill our calling? How are we being called to grow and change? We're working on the assumption that the purpose of worship is to let God get some traction with us, to move us and change us. Part of me was raised with the assumption that the purpose of worship was to manipulate the divine into a more positive predisposition towards us and to hold the anger of God at bay. I've since come to appreciate the purpose of worship is, in fact, not to change God, but to let God change us. And we need to open ourselves to that possibility. So once we have those themes on a calendar, the next step for us then is to form a liturgy and learning planning team. It's made up of lay people. One of the clergy in the parish is part of the team. That's most often me. And that liturgy and learning planning team is then responsible for planning the liturgies for the season based on the theme. They begin, so their task is design, creation, implementation, and evaluation. So they begin by exploring the theme, trying to understand how is it that God is trying to get some traction with us. What does this say about who we are as God's people, or about the world around us where God is already at work? What resources does Scripture and tradition have to offer? How does Scripture kind of illuminate or light the path for us so we see things we couldn't see any other way? How does this particular season offer us opportunities for understanding what it is God's trying to do and to kind of open our hearts to the movement of the Spirit around us? Through that kind of conversation, we develop an overall approach to the season, and we sometimes come up with a focus for each Sunday. I'll say a bit more about that. I'll give you an example in a second. Then, having done that basic design work, we get into creation mode. We write liturgical texts. So we assign liturgical texts to different members of the team. Someone's going to take care of the gathering. Usually the gathering and the sending, they're like bookends, so we do that together. Someone's going to, if we're going to use an affirmation of faith, not a creed, not one of the historic creeds, but if we're using an affirmation of faith, someone will work on that. So what are the most fundamental things we trust that we need to articulate around this theme? Someone else will give some attention to perhaps how we do the prayers of the people and a confession if we're going to use a confession. Someone else will be working on the Eucharistic prayer, the prayer over the gifts and the prayer after communion. They're like bookends on each other, and the Eucharistic prayer itself. The task in this is empowering lay people to find their own theological and pastoral voice, and at the same time, assuring the quality of the Sunday morning experience for everyone. Bit of a challenge, but we've learned a lot as we do that. We also choose music. We also attend to the space. How will we move in the space? How will we decorate the space? Are there some rituals we want to incorporate? Once we come up with a design for the whole overall thing, then we move towards implementation. The first step in implementation is get the rector's blessing. I say that because liturgical ministry belongs to the bishop, in our understanding, and is delegated to the clergy, who exercise that ministry on behalf of and in the trust of the bishop. So it's important that the chief liturgical officer in the parish, which would be the rector, approves of what's happening, because the rector is the one with whom the liturgical buck stops. We also need to work to get everyone on board. So musicians know what they're doing, intercessors know what they're doing, the altar guild knows what's going on, and then we do it. Having done it then, we evaluate the experience and say, what did we learn, what went well, what didn't work, what would you never do again, what's a keeper, and so over time we've been learning a lot through that experience. Let me just give you a little insight into one way of doing that. So this past Advent, for instance, last year on Discernment Day, one of the things that came up was, I'm in a parish full of skeptics, which is a good thing, because the community outside the walls of the parish is full of skeptics too. And one of the questions raised at Discernment Day was, you know, we'd really like to find a way to participate in Christmas with greater integrity, like the shepherds and angels and wise men thing. It feels like it gets in the way. Like, what's really going on with Christmas? And the proposal was that we read a book by a couple of scholars, Mark Sporg and John Dominic Crossan, called The First Christmas, as a way of seeing how could we use Advent to prepare for Christmas in a different way. So we got together, we read the book. As a result of reading the book, people began to say, you know, it's not all about the shepherds and the angels and the wise men. It's all about how God in Jesus is coming to us with the fulfillment of God's deepest hopes for us and our deepest hopes for ourselves. Well, the insight we came to is that there are things about the world we want to see different. Things about life that doesn't work the way it is. Things about relationships between people we want to be different. And we long for a more intimate relationship with God as well. And God is longing for the same things. God's longing for us to be well. God's longing for our relationships to be whole, to be characterized by justice, peace, and compassion. And God longs for a closer relationship with us too. And that's the way we leaned into Advent this year. We came up with a theme for each Sunday, so a new beginning, God upsetting the status quo, God fulfilling our hopes, and our anticipation of that fulfillment. We chose scripture readings to go with those Sundays. Then we divvied up the task. As we reflected on how Advent itself offers resources for that, we were aware of the whole darkness and light play that comes with Advent. And so a lot of the language we used in the liturgy focused on those light and dark themes. Personally, one of my pet peeves about church is liturgical minimalism. The idea that we're going to talk about the blazing light of God's glory in 4 single candles on an Advent wreath, about this big, just doesn't make sense. In the same way that talking about baptism with a drop of water when it should be an experience of drowning, it just doesn't make sense. So in terms of decor, what we did each Sunday is we lit a cluster of candles on the altar. 5 candles the first week, an additional 7 the next week, an additional 9 the next week, an additional 11 on the 4th week, so that by Christmas, the altar was a blaze of light. And so all those things we talked about, how God's light is coming to us, how the darkness is being overcome by the light, and the darkness isn't overcoming the light, like it all kind of made more sense. So we wrote a gathering that involved candlelight. We developed an affirmation of faith that focused on, I'll just read you a few words. We trust in God leading us toward justice, guiding us to wholeness, healing us with unconditional love. We trust in Jesus, the fulfillment of God's promise to us, who reveals God's mission in the world. We trust in the Spirit, breath of hope transforming our hearts, through whom we participate in the triumph of peace. Committing ourselves to work with God to create the world promised by Christmas. We turn from darkness to light at this time and for all time. For the prayers of the people, we gave the intercessors in the parish a refrain to work with. So the refrain of the prayers of the people was, "Come, God of our longing and fulfillment." And the response was, "Come, O come, Emmanuel." We wrote a small confession to be appended to the prayers of the people that again played with those themes. So, God calls us to be partners in the remaking of the world, but we fall short in our response to God's call. When God says, "Let there be light," we're reluctant to emerge from the shadows. When God says, "You are the salt of the earth," we're content to be bland. When God says, "Be strong, do not fear," we're anxious and afraid. And went on from there. The Eucharistic prayer, we acknowledged the work of Jesus in announcing God's coming fulfillment, God's kingdom, in the fulfillment of God's promise to us, and in calling us to be partners with God in the work of God's mission in the world. So, that's just a little example of how we've been doing this. The results of this approach have been compelling. One of my projects for myself is to actually spend some time, more intentional time, documenting and cataloging some of these stories. But we hear now more stories of people whose hearts and minds and even behavior is being changed because they're more engaged in worship. They're hearing things they haven't heard before, and they're hearing things that connect with their life in a better way, because the liturgy is being prepared by other lay people who are similarly struggling with the integration of faith and daily life. It just all makes more sense. Certainly for the people who participated in planning teams, this has been a life-changing experience, because they've spent intentional time in theological and biblical reflection that they've never spent before. One guy in particular I think of is a guy who's been active in our congregation for decades, has been in church all his life, and was on the planning team for Holy Week one year. And he said afterwards that he had been talking about and thinking about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus all his life, and he never knew what it meant. And that through participating in the planning team and preparing our community's worship for Holy Week through to Good Friday, he all of a sudden understood things that made sense to him that had never made sense before. So, what does that have to do with St. Paul's? It seems to me that St. Paul's is at an interesting and graced moment in your life together. The arrangement with McMaster has bought you some time. So it's certainly a good tactical decision, may in fact be a good strategic decision, but it doesn't answer the larger question of how does this community need to be the church in this place at this time? Given God's mission, what God's already up to in the world around us, how does this community need to respond and participate? And so the discernment process that has been proposed with Kristen in Holy Conversations makes a lot of sense. And you now have some breathing space, some time free of immediate anxiety perhaps, to ask yourself the really important questions. Why has God called you together? What are we here for? What's the godly difference God's inviting us to make in the lives of people around us? And how are we going to equip ourselves to fulfill that calling? As you do that, I think it is critically important that the worship of the community on Sunday morning is supporting and challenging that discernment process, so that the conversations you may be having after church with Kristen are actually informed by prayerful reflection in the context of the liturgy itself, so that you make some intentional choices about how we are going to pray our way through this process of discernment. So we'll be talking about that some more on Tuesday night, I understand. I'm delighted to be able to play a role in sharing some of what we've learned at St. Christopher's about this approach here at St. Paul's, so that the Sunday mornings you spend together in Lent, in that discernment process, are going to be deepened and enriched by your prayer around it. So it's not just like a planning process, it really is a spiritual discernment process. And doing that in Lent makes perfect sense to me. Okay, I know it's Epiphany Sunday, a little early to be thinking about Lent, but if you follow the arc of the narrative in Luke's Gospel at least, Jesus is baptized. He goes off into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, biblical code for a long time, and he emerges, apparently understanding who he is, what his life is for, and how to go about his mission, and shows up in his hometown and preaches that whiz-bang first sermon. So that Lent really for Jesus, the time in the wilderness, is really a time of sorting out, what does my baptism mean? Who am I? How shall I fulfill my calling? And it seems to me that's the same process you're being invited into this Lent as well. What does your baptism mean? Who are you really? And how will you fulfill your calling? And I feel honored as a former parishioner and a neighbor to play a small role in that process, because you need to know that we all in the diocese have a big stake in your success. How you do this and how well you do it matters, not just to you, not just to the neighborhood of Westdale, but to the wider church as well.